In April 1945, the greatest concentration of military power in history advanced on a single city. More than 2.5 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, moved to crush the heart of the Third Reich. The war in Europe was about to end, but the price would still be devastating. Just 60 kilometers from the German capital, the Red Army could already see the end. What had once been a distant offensive now turned into a relentless siege. Fortified hills, man-made swamps, and desperate defensive lines tried to hold back the inevitable. Inside the city, elderly men, teenagers, and exhausted soldiers were called up to defend ruins that hadn't even been destroyed yet. And when the ring finally closed, the war ceased to be strategic and became brutal. Street by street, building by building, historic symbols turned into battlefields. Underground, final decisions were being made. On the surface, flags competed for the fate of Europe. How much more blood would be spilled before the final fall? How was the last line of defense broken at the Seelow Heights? What happened inside the city when the fighting became urban and hopeless? And after the surrender, what kind of world would emerge from the smoldering ruins of Berlin? The fall of the Nazi capital was not just the end of a war. It was the starting point of a new world order, built on rubble, silence, and scars that would last for decades. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, tearing through German territory and pushing to within just 60 kilometers of Berlin. What had once seemed far away was now at the doorstep of the Third Reich's capital. This wasn't just a military operation. It was strategic and symbolic. Taking Berlin meant ending the war in Europe and cementing Soviet control over the region. At the heart of the assault was Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, positioned along the Oder River, directly facing the Seelow Heights, the last major defensive line before Berlin. To the south, Ivan Konyev's First Ukrainian Front pushed forward along the Nysa River. To the north, Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front put pressure on the German flank. In total, the Soviets had massed around 2.5 million troops, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, and over 41,000 artillery pieces. It was the single largest concentration of force on the Eastern Front in the entire war. On the German side, the situation was desperate. Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrici, had prepared deep defenses at the Seelow Heights, flooding the lowlands to create artificial marshes, and building 3 fortified lines, with trenches, anti-tank ditches, and artillery positions. Around 766,000 German troops were assigned to the Berlin defense area, but many were exhausted survivors, Volkssturm militiamen, and teenagers from the Hitler Youth. On April 16th, the final offensive began. Roughly 1 million Soviet soldiers, backed by more than 20,000 artillery pieces and tanks, were thrown against the Seelow Heights, defended by about 100,000 Germans. The fighting was savage. In 4 days of battle, around 30,000 Soviets were killed. But by April 19th, the last defensive line had been broken. The road to Berlin was open. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, the artillery of the First Belarusian Front began shelling the center of the Berlin capital. The noose was tightening. To the north and south, Soviet forces were advancing to completely encircle the city. Inside Berlin, German commands still talked about counterattacks. But communications were breaking down, units were scattered, and the enemy was already at the edge of the city. The question was no longer whether Berlin would fall, but how much more blood would be spilled before it did. On April 23, 1945, the encirclement was complete. Forces from the First Belarusian Front and the First Ukrainian Front had closed the ring around the capital. From that moment on, the war ceased to be a battle of maneuver and became a brutal, street-by-street, building-by-building slog. Berlin had turned into a wasteland of rubble and desperate resistance. General Helmut Weidling took command of the city's defense. He had about 45,000 troops, shattered remnants of Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS divisions, reinforced by police, Volkssturm militiamen, and Hitler Youth boys. Many were elderly or barely teenagers. The city was carved into 8 defensive sectors, but they were short on experience, ammo, and coordination. In the southeast, Soviet troops crossed the S-Bahn rail ring and pushed toward the city center. The 5th Shock Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army drove forward in full force. On April 26th, the 8th Guards Army stormed Tempelhof Airport. German resistance was fierce, especially from the Müncheberg and Nordland divisions, which fell back slowly toward the heart of the city. The Soviet axes of advance converged on symbolic targets: Alexanderplatz, Potsdamer Platz, and above all, the Reichstag. Inside that building, the symbol of German power, the fighting would be savage. In the early hours of April 29th, the 3rd Shock Army crossed the Moltke Bridge and began pushing into the surrounding streets. Destroyed bridges kept Soviet artillery from providing full support, but the advance pressed on under heavy fire. Just a few hundred meters away, in the Führer bunker, Hitler signed his last will and testament and married Eva Braun. By dawn on April 30th, the Soviets launched their final assault on the Reichstag with massive artillery support. The building was heavily defended, with entrenched positions and hand-to-hand fighting in its shattered hallways. Even after Soviet troops entered, German soldiers in the basement kept counterattacking. After hours of intense combat, the red flag was raised over the Reichstag. The image, recreated later in a staged photograph, would become the defining symbol of Soviet victory. For Moscow, that moment marked the final collapse of Nazi power. That same day, April 30th, with ammunition running out and the perimeter shrinking, Hitler committed suicide alongside Eva Braun. Their bodies were cremated just outside the bunker. Joseph Goebbels took over as chancellor, but initially refused the unconditional surrender the Soviets demanded. Inside the city, roughly 10,000 German troops remained, concentrated in the center. The Soviet advance had split the defensive area in two, making escape nearly impossible. During the night of May 1st, surrender negotiations were attempted, but fell apart over the Soviet demand for total capitulation. On the night of May 1st to 2nd, the remnants of the garrison tried to break out in 3 directions. Few made it through the Tiergarten and reached the Havel River. Most were killed or captured. At 6 a.m. on May 2nd, General Weidling officially ordered the surrender of all German forces in Berlin. The capital of the Third Reich had fallen. But what did that victory cost? And what kind of world would rise from Berlin's smoldering ruins? When the fighting officially stopped on the morning of May 2nd, 1945, what remained of Berlin was a scene of near total devastation. Streets had become corridors of rubble, buildings were hollow shells, and the civilian population was battered, caught between military collapse and human trauma. The Soviet offensive that began on April 16th had cost the Red Army 81,116 dead and 280,251 wounded or sick. Nearly 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns had been destroyed beyond repair. On the German side, the losses were just as staggering. Estimates range from 92,000 to 100,000 dead, more than 220,000 wounded, and roughly 480,000 soldiers taken prisoner. But the figure that carries the most weight is the civilian one, approximately 125,000 killed during the operation. Beyond the numbers, the city bore the physical and psychological scars of weeks of shelling, street fighting, and institutional collapse. The Brandenburg Gate, the historic symbol of the German capital, stood amid ruins and shattered vehicles. The Reichstag, scorched and pockmarked by shells, became the stage for the image that would seal the end of the war in the East. The Soviet flag raised over the building. That photograph, though restaged later, crystallized the moment the Red Army declared to the world that Berlin had fallen. But the fall of the capital didn't mean the immediate end of all fighting. To the north and south, German units were still trying to retreat and surrender to Western forces. In the north, the 3rd Panzer Army was pushed back against the Elbe River and the Baltic coast, finally surrendering to British and American troops. In the south, the German 9th Army, encircled in the Halbe pocket, suffered massive casualties trying to break out and reach the lines of the 12th Army. Thousands died in that desperate attempt. Meanwhile, on April 25th, Soviet and American troops had already met along the Elbe River near Torgau. That meeting symbolized not just Germany's military collapse, but the new balance of power taking shape in Europe. German territory was, in effect, already divided into the occupation zones the Allies had laid out. Berlin itself would end up deep inside the Soviet occupation zone. The city that had been the heart of Nazi power now became the epicenter of a new ideological struggle. The Soviet advance into the capital cemented Moscow's hold over eastern Germany, while Western forces dug in across the regions under their control. The human cost of the battle has been described as the price of 500,000 lives, dead, wounded, and missing, in just the final weeks of the offensive. World War II in Europe would officially end on May 8, 1945, but the political map of the continent had already been redrawn in the rubble of Berlin. The city that once symbolized the height of the Third Reich now stood for its final collapse. The fall of Berlin wasn't just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new world. But what kind of order would rise from that division? And how would the scars of that siege shape the decades to come in Europe?